I'm Dr. Lawrence Rooij of the University of Toulouse-Capitole, and I'm talking here today about my book, Islam in British Media Discourses. Yeah, so the inspiration for my book was actually a lecture I went to as a master's student, and it made me think about sort of news discourses about Islam and Muslims and the kind of controversies and problems that raises. But there really wasn't any research done about how non-Muslims kind of interact with news stories and media stories about Muslims in a way that identifies or thinks about and the way that they construct opinions about Islam and Muslims. A lot of the conversations and discourses that we hear on a daily basis are that newspapers and news stories and YouTube videos and whatever we encounter every day is turning people's opinion, particularly non-Muslims, against Muslims. But there was no research on it at that time. And so I thought that was a very interesting question, and I tried to test that empirically and understand that better. So the main argument of the book comes to the point where there's three things that are important for any news story in the construction of an opinion by someone reading that story. Firstly, it's that they must have some sort of evaluation of the source. Think of, take something like the Times or the BBC. Your opinion of those sources determines what you think about what they're saying about something, right? If you think that the BBC is the perfect news source and tells everything objectively, you're probably more likely to agree with what it's saying than if you think it's full of shit. Secondly, it's the topic that's being discussed. If you find the topic or the issue that's being presented as important, then again, you're more likely to engage with it in a meaningful way. If you don't think it's important, then you probably ignore it. Think about non-religious subjects. Like the newspapers have a sports section at the back, but a lot of people who might not be interested in sport just skip it. Or if you look at Sunday supplements, there's stuff about the economy or the housing market or whatever. But if that's not something that directly applies to you, then you wouldn't read it. Same as like job advertisements. You don't go there if you're not looking for a job. So it's the same with religious subjects. If you're interested maybe in issues that affect women, then you might be more likely to engage in stories about the hijab or female circumcision or something like that. Whereas, if you're not interested in those subjects, then you probably gloss over them. And lastly, it's kind of the tone or what's being said. And in that sense, you might still think that the source is important. You might be an avid reader of The Guardian. You might think the topic for discussion is really important because you feel that, you have a stake in the debate, or you're interested in what it's talking about, and yet then you might be disappointed with what the journalist has written, or you might feel that the story doesn't reflect accurately what was going on, and that might be because you have your own experiences or your own knowledge about the subject. And so those three things are sort of key and really work together to have people form an opinion of the individual stories that they engage with. And so all those things combined, plus the person's personal history, really define how that all fits together. And that's what makes it interesting and makes these stories relatable to people. The book follows a very kind of simple structure. There are 4 chapters. The first section really tries to have a sort of overview of the sort of history of communication and media in the UK, right? It sets up this idea of how, it provides the reader with an overview of how news and media work, and what is kind of the logic behind it. Why does it work the way it works? Why are certain topics more prevalent than others? All those kind of things. This is then followed by a section that kind of provides a bit of context for the research. So, my research looked at Britain. So, what is the religious makeup of Britain? What is going on? What is the current context? Then the third chapter describes the research, how was it conducted? So in my case, that was a combination of focus groups and some survey questionnaires with participants. In total, I had over 100 people participate. in different contexts. We provided them with different news stories. We had positive ones, negative ones, different sources. It describes all the details in and the process, and kind of what the initial findings were. In the focus groups, essentially, what were the discussions we were having? What were the key themes? Those kind of things. And then the final chapter really kind of ties it all together and tries to answer the question of, well, what does this mean? What do people in different parts of the country? My focus groups were based around the country, so you had different areas, places such as Newcastle, Luton, Bradford, Manchester, all over the country. I avoided London because there's a lot of London-centric research, and London has everyone in it. So I figured, let's try and look at other areas of the country. Again, there are places, like Luton, which has a high Muslim population relatively to the size of the city. But then you've got Newcastle, where I was living, where there's not that many. So you get sort of differences, and does that make a difference? Do you have places? Leicester was another place where the demographic of the city makeup is quite different. So what does that mean? And so again, what do all these things tie together? Plus what we know about how media works and how sort of British society works. What does that all tell us? And so ultimately that's led us to the conclusion that I mentioned before. My next work is another book coming out with Routledge, hopefully sometime next year, and essentially tries to follow up on this and kind of answer the question of like, well, why hasn't anything changed, or why is it so hard to change things? And it really traces a history of, say, the last sort of 50, 60, 70 years of sort of activism in the UK, starting in the 60s, and then, sort of key points in the 80s and 90s, and now more recently with movements such as Black Lives Matter and those kind of things, and trying to trace sort of how activism from either on people of color or for the betterment of people of color, as well as movements for the improvement of the representation of Muslims specifically, how those movements have tried to influence media discourses and political discourses, but actually looking at, well, how have they worked and how have they not worked, and why are certain things more successful than others, but on the whole, why does it still seem to feed a kind of overall Islamophobic media discourse, and why is it so hard to kind of break that narrative and break through? And so that's my next project, and that's what I'm working on currently.